She didn't owe a single dollar. But when three men walked through her door at midnight and told Raina Mercer her sister had borrowed $3 million from the most dangerous man in the city and disappeared without a trace, owing the debt became the least of her problems. Because the man standing in her apartment wasn't just dangerous, he was patient, and patient men are always the most terrifying kind. If this is your kind of story, drop a like, leave your city in the comments, and let me see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight by the time Raina Mercer got home. Not the soft kind of rain that made city people feel poetic about their lives. The ugly kind. The kind that found every hole in your jacket, soaked through your shoes, made the bus smell like 30 different people's misery pressed into one moving box. She'd ridden it for 40 minutes from the university library, where she'd spent the last 7 hours auditing firewall configurations for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company that was paying her $1,600 to tell them their entire server infrastructure was embarrassingly exposed. She'd found 12 vulnerabilities. She'd written 9 pages of technical recommendations. She'd eaten a granola bar for dinner because she forgot to pack lunch and couldn't justify the 20 minutes it would take to leave and come back. That was her life. That was most of it. Raina was 23 years old and perpetually behind. Behind on sleep. Behind on her thesis. Behind on the 3 freelance clients she was juggling alongside her graduate coursework. Behind on the quiet, grinding anxiety that lived in the back of her chest like a stone she'd grown so accustomed to carrying she sometimes forgot it was there. Until she stopped moving and felt the full weight of it settle. She climbed the stairs of her apartment building with her laptop bag across her shoulder and her wet hair stuck to the side of her face. The hallway on the 4th floor smelled like someone had cooked fish 2 days ago, and the building's ventilation system had decided to preserve the moment in amber. She fished her keys from her jacket pocket. She noticed the door was already unlocked. She stopped. Her hand was still on the key. She stood there for 3 seconds, staring at the thin vertical line of light bleeding out from the crack between the door and the frame. She always locked it. She locked it in the morning, double-checked it before taking the elevator, and she hadn't been home since 8 that morning. She was meticulous about it the way people who grew up without much security learn to be meticulous about the small things they can control. The door was unlocked. She should have left. She knew that the second the thought crossed her mind, she should have backed up 4 steps, pulled out her phone, and gone somewhere with other people. That was the rational response. That was what every sensible part of her brain was whispering with increasing urgency. Instead, she pushed the door open because Tessa had a key. Tessa always showed up without warning. Tessa showed up needing things, needing money, needing a place to sleep, needing Raina to cover for her with someone, or talk her down from something, or simply sit across from her at the kitchen table while she decompressed from whatever disaster she'd walked into this time. It had been 3 weeks since Raina had heard from her. 3 weeks of silence, which wasn't unusual for Tessa, but was always long enough to make Raina's stomach do something unpleasant every time her phone buzzed, and it wasn't her. She pushed the door open. It wasn't Tessa. 3 men were standing in her apartment. 2 of them were positioned near the window. Broad, still, the kind of stillness that read less like patience and more like a loaded gun with the safety engaged. They wore dark jackets and said nothing and didn't move when she entered, just tracked her with their eyes the way security cameras do. The 3rd man was sitting in the single armchair she kept near the bookshelf. He was young. That was the first thing she registered because it didn't fit. Mid to late 20s, maybe. Dark hair, sharp features. The kind of face that would have looked at home in a law firm or a finance office, except for the quality of his attention, which was different from anything Raina had encountered in law firms or finance offices or anywhere else. He sat the way people sit when they own the space they're occupying. Not aggressive, just settled, like the apartment had been his since before she arrived, and she was the one who'd interrupted something. He had a manila folder resting on his knee. He hadn't opened it. He looked at her the way you look at an equation you've already solved. "Close the door," he said. His voice was calm. Not quiet. There was a difference. Quiet implied restraint. This was just calm the way temperature is calm. Information without affect. Raina didn't move. Her hand was still on the door handle behind her, and every nerve in her body had gone electric and tight. "Who are you?" It wasn't a question the way she said it. It came out flat, the way fear sometimes does when it bypasses the throat and goes somewhere harder. Lucian Moretti. He didn't gesture. He didn't reach for an ID. He said his name the way people say it when they've never once had to explain why it should mean something. Close the door, Ms. Mercer. I don't have a preference either way, but the conversation we're about to have isn't one you'll want the hallway involved in. She closed the door. She didn't know why she did it. Later, she would turn that moment over in her mind dozens of times, picking at it, trying to understand what had moved her feet. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more specific than both of those things. The recognition, cellular and immediate, that this situation had already started without her, and closing the door was not the decision that mattered. She set her bag down near the entrance, slowly, keeping her eyes on him. How did you get in? The door was unlocked. It wasn't. A beat. He didn't concede it or argue it. He just moved past it like a man who didn't have time to inventory every small truth. Your sister owes my organization $3 million. The floor dropped out. Not literally. She was still standing on it, still felt the worn hardwood under her wet shoes, still heard the rain battering the window behind the two men who had not moved or spoken. But something in her understanding of the room rearranged itself violently. The way the world rearranges when you miss a step in the dark and your entire body drops before your brain catches up. That's not possible, she said. The number is accurate. Tessa doesn't have... She's not involved with... She stopped herself. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and made herself slow down, because the thing about Tessa was that Raina had said those sentences before. Tessa doesn't do that. Tessa isn't capable of that. You don't understand, she's not that kind of person. She'd said those sentences so many times over the years that she'd worn grooves in them, and every time she'd been wrong, she'd had to sand them down and say them again slightly quieter. $3 million. Where is she? Raina said. That's the other matter. He opened the folder then, set it on the arm of the chair, angled so she couldn't see it from where she stood. 3 days ago, your sister withdrew the remainder of her personal accounts, sold 2 items she'd been using as collateral with a private dealer, and stopped responding to contact. Her apartment has been vacated. Raina stared at him. She ran. She ran. The stone in her chest got heavier. She was surprised, but she wasn't surprised, and that distinction felt worse than either thing alone would have. Tessa had always been capable of it, of cutting and running when the ground started heating. She'd done it at 17 with a boyfriend who'd turned violent. She'd done it at 20 with a business partner who turned out to be laundering money through their small catering operation. She'd always had that gear, dude. The one that engaged before the rest of her, that moved her body out of range while her mind was still pretending things were fine. But $3 million. I don't have that kind of money, Raina said. I know. Then why are you here? He looked at her for a moment. Those eyes were pale, ice blue, the kind that didn't warm at the edges the way most blue eyes do in low light. They just stayed the same temperature regardless of what was happening around them. Because the debt doesn't disappear when the debtor does. It transfers. To who? To available family. The room was very quiet except for the rain. I'm not available family, Raina said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. I didn't co-sign anything. I didn't guarantee anything. Whatever agreement your organization made with my sister has nothing to do with me legally or Ms. Mercer. He said it softly, not cutting her off so much as just stepping in front of her words. I want to be clear about something. I'm not here as a legal matter. The structure I'm describing isn't a civil action. There's no court involved. I'm telling you the way it works, not asking you to agree with it. She felt the back of her neck go cold. He continued without any particular urgency. You have 72 hours. To do what? Produce $3 million? Or face the consequences yourself? The word consequences sat in the air between them and didn't elaborate. That was deliberate, she understood. The gap was deliberate. A specific, open amount of space for her imagination to fill, which was always more efficient than the actual threat, because the imagination is subject to the fear doing the work. Hers did the work. I need you to leave, she said. He stood. He was taller than she'd calculated from across the room. Not imposing exactly, but present in the way that some people are present, like they take up slightly more space than their physical dimensions account for. He picked up the folder. He walked toward the door, and both men near the window moved in sequence. The fluid coordination of people who do this often enough that they no longer have to think about it. He stopped at the door. Didn't turn fully. Whatever you're thinking about doing in the next 72 hours, calling the police, leaving the city, finding someone to help you, I want you to think carefully about the range of outcomes each of those produces. Not for my sake. A pause. For yours. Then they were gone. She stood in her apartment and listened to the sound of the rain and her own breathing, which had gone shallow without her noticing. She became aware of the fact that her hands were shaking. Not visibly. She looked at them and they were still, but there was a tremor underneath the surface, vibrating at a frequency she could feel in her palms and wrists, and nowhere else. $3 million. She walked to the kitchen. She ran the tap and drank water straight from the cupped sink of her hand because she couldn't locate the rational muscle required to open the cabinet and get a glass. The water was cold and tasted like pipes, and she stood with her hands braced against the edge of the sink and looked at the drain and thought about Tessa. Not with anger, not yet. With something flatter. Something closer to a woman staring at the ruins of a house she'd known was going to burn down and trying to figure out how she'd still ended up inside when the match was struck. Tessa was 31, 8 years older, which meant 8 years of Raina watching her from the slight remove of the younger one, the responsible one, the one who did the math on things. She'd watched Tessa walk into bad situations with the specific kind of confidence that isn't really confidence at all, but is actually the refusal to believe in consequences. And she'd watched her walk out again, most of the time, scraped up and a little thinner, but fundamentally intact, because Tessa had always had luck the way some people have a talent they never practiced. Things broke in her favor. People softened. Crises resolved. $3 million was not a crisis that resolved. Raina straightened. She dried her hands on her jeans and stood in the middle of her small kitchen and thought methodically about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew Tessa gambled, had been gambling in some form since she was 22, which started with poker nights that were mostly social and ended with, well, this, apparently. Casino debt she'd managed to conceal for years, paid down in patches, borrowed against, restructured in ways that had apparently landed her deep inside a network that Raina had never known she was involved with. She knew the name Lucien Moretti the way people in the city knew it without ever having said it out loud. The way it lived in a specific category of knowledge, things you absorbed from news reports that never quite named anything directly, from rumors that spread sideways through professional networks, from the things people lowered their voices to say and then moved on from quickly. A name that was tied, loosely but persistently, to money that moved in unusual directions and people who disappeared when they became inconvenient. She hadn't known he was real in the way that he was real. Standing in her armchair real. Using her name real. 72 hours. She pulled out her phone and called Tessa's number. The line rang 7 times and went to voicemail. She listened to Tessa's recorded voice. Bright, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never in their life anticipated having a difficult conversation and had arranged their entire voicemail greeting around that assumption, and hung up without leaving a message. She called again. Voicemail on the 3rd ring this time. She stood by the window and watched the rain hit the glass and tried to think about what $3 million looked like in practical terms. She made $40,000 a year through her combination of graduate stipend and freelance work when the contracts were good. She had $11,000 in savings, built over 3 years of deliberate, painful accumulation. She had no investments, no property, no family assets. Her mother had died when she was 16, her father before that, and whatever small inheritance there might have been had gone to keeping them both housed and fed through a year that Raina did not allow herself to think about in any sustained way. She had $11,000. She had 72 hours. She went to her laptop. She spent the first hour doing what she always did when she was afraid, which was work. She pulled up everything she could find on Moretti. Not the scrubbed public record, not the legitimate business registry entries, but the edges. Forum threads from financial crime watchdog communities. Archived news articles that had been taken down but cached imperfectly. Court documents from cases that had been dismissed or settled with their exhibits still attached. The picture that assembled itself was not a portrait. It was more like a shadow, the shape of something very large that you understood through what it blocked. Moretti Capital Group, International Logistics Networks, 3 shell entities in the Cayman structure, consulting arrangements with enough legitimate businesses to paper over the rest. 2 federal investigations that had closed without charges, once in 2019 and once in 2022. He was 27 years old. She found one photograph pulled from a society page at a charitable gala 4 years ago. He was standing at the edge of the frame, not centered, as if he'd been caught by accident. The same expression he'd worn in her apartment. That settled, solved look. He'd taken over the organization at 24 after his father's death. She found the obituary. She's a small one, strangely small for a man who had apparently accumulated that kind of power. Cardiac event. No further details. Raina sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the physics of her situation. She could call the police. She thought about what he'd said, the careful, non-specific mention of outcomes, and she thought about the 2 investigations that had been closed, and she thought about what it meant to become officially a person who had reported Lucien Moretti to law enforcement and then continued to live in this city. She thought about that for approximately 90 seconds before she set it aside. She could try to find Tessa. She had no idea where Tessa had gone. She could try to trace her, check credit card transactions if Tessa had been careless, check mutual contacts. But Tessa had done this before, not at this scale, and she knew how to disappear when she wanted to. She'd been disappearing from Raina since Raina was 15 years old and knew the mechanics of it by now. She could try to raise money. She thought about this one the longest, sitting with it in the way you sometimes sit with an idea you know is impossible just to feel the full shape of its impossibility. She could liquidate everything she had and produce $11,000. She had professional contacts, other freelancers, a few clients who'd expressed satisfaction with her work in terms that implied ongoing relationships. But there was no path from any of that to $3 million in 72 hours that didn't require something criminal. And the thing about being in a situation with criminal people was that it was exactly the wrong time to commit your first crime. 72 hours. She stayed awake the whole first night. Not productively. She passed through productive and out the other side into that state of exhausted alertness where the brain keeps moving but without traction, thoughts spinning in place. She made more coffee than she drank. She opened and closed browser tabs. She started drafts of messages she didn't send. She thought about the way he'd said consequences, the pause before and after, the way he'd let it sit there doing its work. She thought about Tessa at 22, first time she'd borrowed money from someone who wasn't a bank. Raina had been 14. She'd found out later, much later. Tessa had paid it back and never mentioned it, and Raina hadn't asked because asking Tessa the right question at the right time had always been a skill she'd never quite developed. There was always some softness in her that preferred not to know, preferred to let the silence between them stay comfortable, even when she suspected the thing underneath it wasn't. That was her own failure. She was clear-eyed about it now, in this kitchen at 4 a.m, in a way she hadn't always been. She had been complicit in Tessa's version of things, not consciously, not willingly, but by sustained, deliberate choice. The second day she spent trying to contact Tessa through every channel she had. Friends from the casino circuit, people Tessa had mentioned once or twice, names Raina had filed away with the uneasy attentiveness of someone who knows the information might matter. A woman named Darcy, who worked management at one of the larger private gaming clubs. A man named Santos, who Tessa had described as a friend, but whose exact relationship had always been imprecise in a way that made Raina's instincts hum. Darcy didn't pick up. Santos picked up, listened to 30 seconds of Raina's careful, controlled explanation, and said, "I don't know anything about that," in the voice of someone who knew something about that, then ended the call. She went to Tessa's apartment. The landlord let her in when she explained she was family. The apartment was cleaned out, not stripped, not rushed, but gone. Personal items removed, closet emptied, the particular blankness of a space that has been vacated with intention. Someone had taken their time. Tessa had known she was going before she went. Raina stood in the middle of Tessa's empty living room and felt something shift in her chest. Not collapse, more like the structural settlement of something that had been leaning for years and had finally found its natural position against the ground. She'd always known Tessa would do something like this someday. She just hadn't known she'd be the one still standing in the rubble. On the third day, with less than 20 hours remaining, she got a message. A text from a number she didn't recognize, 9 words. "Don't make a decision without talking to me first." She stared at it. She typed back, "Tessa?" The number went silent. She tried calling it. It rang and went to nothing. Not voicemail, just dead air that eventually disconnected. She spent 4 hours trying to trace the number through every method she had access to. It was a prepaid. Purchased 2 states away from a convenience store chain. The carrier's data gave her nothing beyond the purchase location. She checked the timestamp. The message had been sent at 2:47 in the morning. Tessa was alive. That was what the message meant. Tessa was alive and had reached out, which meant she knew what was happening, which meant she'd known what was going to happen when she left. The anger that arrived wasn't hot. It wasn't the kind of anger that moves through you in a wave and recedes. It was cold and very specific, seated precisely in the gap between what Tessa had done and what Raina had spent 7 years doing in response to Tessa's choices. Every freelance contract she'd pushed through on 4 hours of sleep. Every dinner she'd skipped. Every month she'd looked at her bank balance and calculated exactly what she had versus exactly what Tessa needed and moved the numbers around to make it work. $3 million. The knock came at 7 in the evening of the 3rd day. She opened the door, already knowing. Lucienne Moretti stood in the hallway, alone this time. No jacket, just a dark sweater, dark trousers, the kind of clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but had no interest in announcing it. He looked at her with that same quality of attention, the kind that felt less like being watched and more like being calculated. "Your 72 hours are up," he said. "I know. Did you find her?" "No." A beat. "She found me. Sort of." She watched his expression, looking for something. Surprise, calculation, a flicker of anything that would tell her what he already knew. She found nothing useful. His face was not a readable document. "She sent me a message telling me not to make a decision without talking to her first. I haven't been able to reach her since." He stood very still. "What decision?" "I assume yours." A moment passed. He looked at her in that particular way of his, and she had the unsettling impression, not for the first time, that he was several sentences ahead in the conversation and was simply waiting for her to arrive where he already was. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back. He came in and didn't look around the apartment this time. The first time he'd sat in it like he owned it. Now he stood near the center of the room, hands at his sides, and she stood across from him near the kitchen doorway, and they faced each other in the specific way of two people who are trying to read the other's intentions before committing to a direction. "I have a proposal," he said. Raina said nothing. "You're good at what you do. I've had 3 days to look at your work." He didn't specify how he'd accessed her work. She didn't ask. "The pharmaceutical audit you completed 2 nights ago identified vulnerabilities that our own security consultants missed in a review of the same system 4 months ago. Your organization uses that pharmaceutical company. Our organization has financial interests in several entities across similar sectors. Security is a persistent concern." He paused. "The proposal is this. You come to work for me, exclusively. Your expertise applied to protecting our network infrastructure, identifying exposure, managing the digital architecture of operations that require that kind of discretion. In exchange, the debt is suspended." "Suspended," she said. "Not cleared. Suspended. Contingent on your sister's situation. If she's found, the existing terms apply to her. The debt remains as a structure, but your personal exposure ends. And if I refuse, then the original terms apply, and we have a very different kind of conversation." She looked at him. She thought about the empty apartment. She thought about the text message. "Don't make a decision without talking to me first." And the prepaid phone and the purchase 2 states away. "For how long?" she said. "Indefinitely, to start. With renegotiation available after 6 months if performance warrants it." "Where?" "My estate. Outside the city. You'd be housed there during the term of employment." "I'm a graduate student. I have a thesis, which can be completed remotely. Your university program is online dominant. You have 2 fieldwork requirements remaining, both of which can be satisfied with commutes." He checked. Of course he'd checked. He'd spent 3 days on her the same way she'd spent 3 days on him, and the difference was he'd probably found more, and found it faster. She thought about what saying yes meant. She thought about what saying no meant. She ran the math on it the way she ran all math. Not with optimism, not with the cushion of wishful thinking, but straight, current position, available paths, most likely outcomes at the end of each. She thought about Tessa somewhere 2 states away with a prepaid phone and enough self-preservation to reach out and not enough accountability to stay reachable. "I want an agreement in writing," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, something a degree below surprise, the slight recalibration of someone who got an answer they considered possible but not most likely. "That can be arranged. And I want it reviewed by an attorney before I sign anything. You have someone in mind." "I'll find someone." "You have 48 hours to complete that process." She nodded, tightly. The stone in her chest was still there, heavier than it had been yesterday, heavier than it had been 3 days ago when she'd climbed the stairs and found her door unlocked. But its shape had changed slightly. It had acquired edges, which was different from being a formless weight. You could work around edges. You could find the orientation that made them bearable to carry. "Miss Mercer?" he said, moving back toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her, and for just a second, less than a second, a fraction of a thing, she thought she saw something in those ice-blue eyes that wasn't calculated. Something that had been there the whole time underneath the stillness, so quiet she'd almost missed it. "Your sister sent you that message because she needs you to stay accessible. Whatever she told you not to decide, she's already decided something herself. You should think about that." He left. She stood in the middle of her apartment and stared at the door and felt the cold truth of it land somewhere between her sternum and her spine. Tessa had reached out not to warn her. Tessa had reached out to manage her. She picked up her phone and looked at the text again. "Don't make a decision without talking to me first." 9 words designed to buy time. To keep Raina hesitating, pausing, waiting for a follow-up conversation that Tessa had no intention of having. To keep her sister suspended in uncertainty while Tessa figured out her next move, which was never about Raina, which had never, in 31 years, been about anyone except Tessa. Raina set the phone down on the counter face down and stood in the quiet and felt something change in her chest again. Not the shift of settlement this time. Something harder, colder. She picked the phone back up and opened her contacts and started looking for an attorney. Because if Tessa had already made her decision, then Raina was done waiting to make hers. She signed the papers 36 hours later in the office of a 60-year-old contract attorney named Weiss, who had the permanently skeptical expression of a man who had spent decades reading agreements written to obscure exactly what they were. He'd reviewed the document for 6 hours, come back with 11 requests for modification, and received 9 of them. "This is an employment contract in the way that a controlled substance is a headache remedy," Weiss told her, flat, over the rim of his glasses. "It does what it says, and the side effects are significant." "I know. You're agreeing to exclusivity. You're agreeing to residency at the employer's premises. You're agreeing to a non-disclosure scope that I've never seen outside of a government clearance." "I know." "And you understand who this employer is?" She looked at him. "Do you?" A beat. He looked back at the document. "Enough," he said, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 4 days. He signed where the notary required. She signed where indicated. The driver waiting outside, she hadn't asked for a driver, he'd appeared, took the executed copies without expression and drove her back to her apartment. She had 2 days to pack what she needed. She packed a single suitcase. She called the pharmaceutical client and told them she was going off-grid for a minimum of 6 months and referred them to a colleague. She sent an email to her thesis advisor explaining a family emergency requiring temporary relocation. She stood in her apartment on the last morning and looked at the books on the shelf, the worn edge of the armchair where Lucien Moretti had sat with his folder and his pale eyes and his terrible patience, and the window where the rain had been coming down on the night that everything changed. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure what she would have been crying for exactly. The life she was leaving had never been the life she'd wanted. It had been the life she'd assembled from what was available after spending years managing someone else's mess. Maybe that was what she was mourning, not what she was leaving. What she was mourning was the version of herself that had never gotten to want anything at all. The car came at 9 in the morning. She walked out of the building with her suitcase and got in without looking back, and the city moved past the windows in the flat gray light of early winter. and she pressed her palm flat against her thigh to keep her hand from shaking, and she thought about the message still sitting on her phone. Don't make a decision without talking to me first. She'd made her decision. She hadn't talked to Tessa. The car left the city behind and moved out onto the highway, and the estate appeared an hour later through the windshield, stone and iron and glass behind a tree line, sprawling and deliberate and very, very quiet. And as the gates opened and the car moved through, Raina Mercer felt for the first time in 3 days something that wasn't fear. She wasn't sure yet what it was, but it wasn't fear.
What she didn't know,
What she couldn't have known, sitting in the back of that car watching the estate take shape through the bare winter trees, was that somewhere inside those walls, a secret was already waiting for her. One that would make the debt and the threats and the 72 hours look like the opening act. One that had Tessa's fingerprints all over it. The estate was bigger on the inside than it looked from the gate. That was the first thing Raina noticed. Not the architecture, not the security cameras positioned at every blind angle of the perimeter, not the man who met the car at the front entrance and took her suitcase without introducing himself. It was the scale of the interior that registered first, the way a space can communicate power, not through decoration, but through sheer volume of air. Ceilings that went up farther than they needed to, hallways that were wider than function required, rooms positioned at intervals that suggested the person who designed this building understood that distance between people was its own form of control. She was shown to a room on the second floor, east wing. It was larger than her entire apartment. The bed was a king, dark wood frame, white linens without a wrinkle in them. A desk near the window with a monitor already set up, which told her the room had been prepared for her specifically, not for a generic guest. The window looked out over the back grounds, a long expanse of winter gray lawn rolling toward a tree line. The whole thing wrapped in the specific silence of property that had enough land between itself and the rest of the world to make noise optional. There was a laptop on the desk, not hers. New, still with the faint chemical smell of factory plastic. She didn't touch it. A woman knocked and entered without waiting for an answer. 50s, sharp posture, the practiced efficiency of someone who had been running a large household for long enough that every movement had been stripped of anything extraneous. Her name was Mrs. Holt. She said it the way people say their names in professional context, like a title rather than an identity. She explained the meal schedule, the areas of the estate that were accessible and the ones that weren't, the protocol for requesting anything she needed. What areas aren't accessible, Raina said. The north wing, Mr. Moretti's private offices, the lower level. A beat, precise and unreadable. You'll receive additional access as your employment develops. As it develops? Raina repeated. What does that mean? That's a question for Mr. Moretti. She set a key card on the dresser. Dinner is at 7. He'll expect you. She left. Raina stood in the middle of the room and breathed. She unpacked her suitcase methodically. Clothes in the wardrobe, toiletries in the bathroom that was also larger than necessary, her own laptop set up on the desk beside the one they'd provided. She opened her laptop and checked the network. There was a guest connection available and a secured organizational network requiring credentials she didn't have yet. She noted the architecture of what she could see from the outside. It was sophisticated, not impenetrable. Nothing was impenetrable, but whoever had built it knew what they were doing and had invested significantly in doing it right. At 7:10, she walked downstairs. Lucien was already seated at the head of a dining table that could have accommodated 12 people. He was reading something on a tablet, a glass of water to his right, and he looked up when she entered with the same quality of attention he'd given her apartment. Complete, immediate, betraying nothing. You're late, he said. By 10 minutes. Sit. She sat. Not at the far end, which would have been absurd and theatrical, but 2 seats away from him, which felt like the correct distance for 2 people who had signed a contract with each other and were now figuring out what that meant in practice. A staff member served without speaking. The food was good, simple and precise, the kind of cooking that had nothing to prove. You didn't touch the laptop, he said, without looking up from the tablet. It's not my laptop. It's been configured for your work. I'll use my own equipment until I've audited what's on it. He looked up then. Something in his expression shifted. Not displeasure exactly, but reassessment. The same micro-recalibration she'd seen in her apartment when she'd asked for the written agreement. That's a reasonable position. I know. He set the tablet down. Tomorrow morning, I'll have Carver walk you through the network architecture. He runs our technical security team. You'll work alongside him initially. In what capacity? Assessment. We have 3 areas of persistent concern. A data pipeline that's been showing irregular traffic patterns, a vendor access portal that was audited 6 months ago and is due for review, and a communication system that we inherited when we acquired a shipping company last year and haven't fully integrated. Raina listened. She was already mentally categorizing the problems. The data pipeline irregularity was the interesting one. The kind of symptom that could mean a dozen different things, ranging from a configuration error to something deliberate. Who knows I'm here? Carver and Mrs. Holt, 3 others on the security staff who coordinated your arrival. Not the rest of the household. You're employed as a private technical consultant. That's the story if anyone asks. And Carver, does he know why, specifically? He knows you're competent. He doesn't know the circumstances. She nodded. She ate. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who were both independently doing the math on each other and had reached an unspoken agreement to let the math run without interruption. Your sister hasn't made contact again, he said. It wasn't a question. No. If she does, you'll know, she said it flatly. That was in the agreement. He looked at her for a moment. I want to know immediately, not after you've spoken with her, before you respond. Before I respond, she repeated. The things she felt about that instruction had edges, and she felt them, but she swallowed it. Fine. He picked up his tablet again. You'll start at 8 tomorrow. She left the table before he did. She lay in the vast white bed that night and stared at the ceiling and listened to the absolute quiet of the estate. In her apartment, there had always been sound. The buildings settling, the street below, the specific acoustic texture of a city that never fully went to sleep. Here, there was nothing. Not peace. Peace would have felt restful. This was just the absence of noise, which was different, like the difference between relief and absence of pain. She slept badly and woke at 6 with her mind already moving. Carver was not what she expected. He was maybe 40, compact, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard and showed it, a scar along his jaw that had healed years ago but hadn't been managed, close-cut hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that assessed her in approximately 2 seconds and put her somewhere in a mental filing system. He wasn't unfriendly. He was efficient in the way that people are efficient when they've learned that efficiency prevents misunderstanding and misunderstanding costs things. You go by Raina, he said. Yes. Carver. He pulled up a network topology diagram on the main monitor in the technical operations room, which was on the ground floor of the East Wing and had the controlled temperature and cable management of a room that someone actually cared about. How familiar are you with segmented architecture? Reasonably. Define reasonably. She looked at the diagram. You're running 3 isolated segments with a gapped protocol between the primary and secondary. That's the shipping integration you're trying to absorb. The data pipeline irregularity is showing on segment 2, which is where your financial traffic routes. And whoever built segment 3 did it correctly, but left a legacy authentication layer from the original system that hasn't been deprecated. Which means you've got a theoretical re-entry point anytime someone with the old credential structure comes knocking. A pause. Carver looked at the diagram, then at her. You got all that from looking at it for 30 seconds. 20. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said, in the voice of someone adjusting their estimate. Let's start with the pipeline. She worked for 9 hours straight. It wasn't unusual for her. She had the capacity for sustained technical focus that sometimes alarmed people who tried to have human conversations with her while she was in it, because she went somewhere slightly inside herself, and the outside world became auditory information rather than anything requiring real response. Carver noticed this by the 3rd hour and stopped trying to make small talk, which she appreciated. The pipeline irregularity was sophisticated, not a configuration error. The traffic pattern had a regularity to it. Not random, not chaotic, that suggested something deliberate running underneath the legitimate flow. Tiny packets of data moving at intervals spaced far enough apart to avoid triggering threshold alerts routed through a vendor access point that had the right credentials, but was being used at off hours that didn't match the vendor's operational profile. She flagged it without saying what she thought it was. She wanted to check something first. "How long has this pattern been running?" she asked Carver. He pulled up the logs. "First instance we can confirm, 14 weeks ago." She went still. 14 weeks. She thought about that. She thought about what she knew about Tessa's timeline, when the gambling debt had apparently reached its crisis point, when Tessa had started liquidating things. The numbers lined up in a way that sat in her chest like a splinter. She didn't say anything to Carver. "I need the vendor access logs for the last 6 months," she said. "Full credential activity, including failed attempts. I can get those by end of day." Good. She went back to the pipeline. The weeks that followed had a texture she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected isolation, the estate as a kind of controlled confinement, a gilded version of the pressure she was under, service staff and security watching her movements while she sat in a room and did work she'd been coerced into doing. What she found instead was something more complicated, and complications were the things that Raina was least equipped to protect herself against. The work was genuinely interesting. This was the problem she hadn't predicted. The network she'd been dropped into was vast and multi-layered and full of exactly the kind of technical puzzles that she'd spent years training herself to solve, and the resources available to her, hardware, software, access to data she'd have had to spend weeks acquiring through legitimate channels in any other context, were extraordinary. She found herself staying at the workstation past midnight, not because she had to, but because the next question was always right there, one more thread to pull. She found herself thinking about problems in the shower, at dinner, on the rare occasion she walked the east grounds in the afternoon when the light was low and gray and the cold had settled into the trees. And she found herself thinking about Lucien Moretti, not in the way she'd have admitted to anyone, not in a way she fully admitted to herself for the first 3 weeks. More as a technical problem, the way you think about a system you're trying to understand, mapping it, looking for the pattern under the behavior. She observed him the way she observed everything, methodically and without announcing that she was doing it. He was in the operational center most mornings, reviewing reports before the rest of the senior staff arrived. He had a quality of stillness that she'd registered from the first night, but understood better now. It wasn't the stillness of someone suppressing emotion, it was the stillness of someone whose baseline processing happened internally at a speed that made external expression redundant. He thought fast and spoke slowly, and the gap between those two things was what looked like coldness from the outside. He asked her questions about the work that were sharper than she expected. Not technical questions. He knew his limitations there and didn't perform expertise he didn't have, but strategic ones. What are the implications if this exposure is already being exploited? What's the realistic threat model for an organization with these specific international vectors? Where would you look next if you were someone trying to get in? She answered him directly. She didn't soften it or pat it, and she noticed that he responded to directness with more engagement than he offered almost anyone else. On a Thursday, 4 weeks in, she passed him in the hallway outside the library, and he stopped. "The pipeline analysis you submitted yesterday," he said. "The vendor. What about it?" "You know who it is." She looked at him. She'd written the report carefully, technically precise, attribution neutral, all the data and none of the interpretation she hadn't verified. "I have a hypothesis. Tell me." "Not yet." His jaw tightened, slightly. She'd been watching for it long enough now to catch the small movements. "I pay you to—" "You pay me to be accurate," she said. "I'll be accurate when I'm ready. A wrong hypothesis in this kind of investigation doesn't just fail. It actively damages your ability to find the right answer. I have 2 more things I need to check." He held her gaze for long enough that she felt her shoulders tighten against her will. Then, "How long?" "A few days." He stepped aside to let her pass. She walked down the hallway with her spine straight and her heart beating approximately 30% faster than necessary, and she didn't allow any of that to show. There was a man named Dax. He was part of the internal security rotation, early 30s, with an easy manner that she'd initially classified as professional warmth and slowly reclassified as something else. He'd made it his business to be around when she was working late, offering coffee, making conversation in a way that was friendly and attentive and slightly too interested in the details of what she was working on. She'd started giving him partial and misleading information 2 weeks ago, framed as casual asides. Technical things she mentioned in passing, incomplete data about her process, a detail about a system she was looking at, the direction she was supposedly taking on an analysis. On a Tuesday evening, she found a redundant copy of her local work directory on the organizational network, placed in a folder 4 levels deep that had no business reason to exist. It contained only the falsified information she'd fed Dax. She sat with that for 3 minutes. Then she forwarded the evidence to Carver's secure channel and wrote 4 lines. "There's a leak inside your technical team. It's Dax. Here's the proof. I need you to handle it without telling him how it was found." Carver's response came in 12 minutes. "Understood." Dax was gone by the following morning. No announcement, no explanation. His workstation cleared, his access revoked, his absence absorbed by the household's operational silence the way the estate absorbed everything, completely, without residue. Carver came to her desk that afternoon and set down a mug of coffee. "You fed him bad information," he said. "Yes." "How long ago did you make him?" 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." "I needed the evidence first. Suspicion without proof is just suspicion, and in an environment like this, a wrong accusation damages more than a delayed one." He looked at her for a moment with that quick filing cabinet assessment. "Moretti know? Does he need to?" "He'd want to." She picked up the coffee. "Then tell him." Ushian came to the operations room that evening. She was still at the workstation. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. "Carver briefed me," he said. "Okay." "You ran a counterintelligence operation inside my estate and didn't inform me." "I ran an information integrity operation. The result was the same." "Raina." He said her name differently than he had in the first weeks, slightly less formal. It had happened gradually, and she'd noted it without responding to it. "Look at me." She turned in the chair. He was standing a few feet from the workstation, jacket off, the faint loosening of his posture that appeared sometimes in the evenings when the formal architecture of his manner relaxed by approximately 10%. "I had a mole in your technical team passing information to an external channel I haven't fully traced yet. I removed the mole. The rest of the investigation is ongoing. I'm telling you now." "You should have told me when you identified him." "I didn't have proof until I had the file copy. If I told you before that and you'd acted on suspicion, we'd have lost the evidence chain." He stood there looking at her with those pale eyes. The light in the room was low. She worked better in low light, and Mrs. Holt had apparently passed that along because the overhead had been replaced with a desk lamp at some point in week 2. In the low light, his face had less of the controlled surface quality it wore in meetings and direct sunlight, and there was something more present in it, more actual. "You were protecting the investigation," he said. "I was protecting your network, which is the job." Another pause. Then, "What's the external channel?" "I'm still mapping it. Approximately. The packets are routing through a secondary bounce in Southeast Asia before they disperse. I've got 3 more hops to trace. Give me another week." He nodded. He didn't move to leave immediately, which was unusual. He had a habit of entering a room, conducting the business, and departing with the brisk efficiency of someone who treated conversation as a resource to be consumed purposefully. Standing still without a clear agenda was not his default. "Dax had been here 4 years, he said, finally. Not with emotion, with the flat factual weight of information being processed. Long-term plants are more valuable than short-term ones. Whoever put him here invested in patience." "That's a specific kind of enemy." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her for another moment. "Good work," he said, like it cost him something small to say it. Then he left. She turned back to her workstation and stared at the network diagram and breathed. The problem with Lucien Moretti, she was beginning to understand, was not that he was frightening. The first night version of him had been frightening. The ice and the stillness and the specific quality of threat that he carried without needing to reference it. But the estate version of him was something different. The estate version was a man who worked 18-hour days and ate dinner with the focused efficiency of someone refueling rather than resting, who occasionally stopped in doorways to observe something without commenting on it, who had, she had discovered from Mrs. Holt in the neutral tones of long service, not taken a day away from the estate in 7 months. The problem was that she was beginning to recognize him. Not understand. Recognition and understanding were different. She recognized the quality in him, the way he carried the load without adjusting his posture around it, the particular discipline of someone who has decided at some point that needing things is inefficient. She understood that quality because she had it. It was a dangerous thing to recognize in someone. She was 3 hours into the trace on the external data channel when she found the thread that changed everything. The packets were routing through Southeast Asia. She'd confirmed that much. But the bounce point wasn't as clean as a professional operation would keep it. There was a signature in the packet construction, small and probably unintentional, the digital equivalent of a tell. It came from the encoding method, a specific, slightly idiosyncratic compression approach that she had seen before. She had seen it on Tessa's personal laptop. 3 years ago, Raina had cleaned up a software configuration for Tessa's computer after a bad download had cluttered the system. She'd noticed the compression settings Tessa used for her file transfers. Unusual, a legacy method that Tessa had picked up from somewhere and never changed, because she didn't think about these things, just used what was familiar. A fingerprint, the kind that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who hadn't seen it in the original context. Raina's hand stopped moving over the keyboard. She sat very still in the low light of the operations room and felt the full weight of what she was looking at. The leak inside Lucian's network, the data flowing out through DAX and bouncing through Southeast Asia, the encoding signature. Tessa. Her sister hadn't just borrowed $3 million and run. Tessa hadn't just disappeared into the wind like she'd always done with smaller disasters. Tessa had been inside the network, actively, deliberately inside it, selling operational information to someone on the outside, using a plant she'd somehow cultivated or recruited inside the estate, running it all through a routing chain designed to stay invisible. 14 weeks. It had started 14 weeks ago, which meant it had started before the debt crisis came to a head, which meant the debt crisis and this were related, not coincidence, not separate disasters colliding. One operation. Tessa had borrowed money she couldn't repay, not because she was reckless. She'd borrowed it because she needed access to the kind of people who needed what she was selling. Raina stared at the screen. The text message. Don't make a decision without talking to me first. Not a warning. Not even really concern. A management play. Tessa had needed her to hesitate, to not sign with Lucien, to not be inside the network, because Raina inside the network was the one thing that could do exactly what Raina had just done. Find the thread, pull it, trace it back. And here she was, inside the network. Her hands were flat on the desk. She was aware of her own breathing, the way it had gone shallow and careful. The way her body was doing the processing her mind was still catching up to. The anger from 3 weeks ago, the cold, specific anger she'd felt staring at Tessa's voicemail in her kitchen, was back. But it was different now. It had weight and direction. It pointed somewhere. She thought about what this information meant. She thought about what she was required by her agreement to do with it. She thought about Tessa's voice on that voicemail recording. "Hi, you've reached Tessa. Leave a message." Bright, unhurried, the voice of someone who has never anticipated having a difficult conversation. She thought about who Tessa was selling to, because Dax's leak had a destination, and that destination had a structure she'd been mapping for 2 weeks without knowing what she was mapping. It was receiving the organizational intelligence that was being pulled from Lucien's network, and it was big enough to have 3 different geographic reception points for the incoming data, and it had the architecture of something that was being prepared for a specific action rather than ongoing intelligence collection. Someone wasn't just watching Lucien's empire. Someone was preparing to move against it, and they'd been using Tessa to hold the door open. Raina saved the full analysis to an encrypted local partition. She went back through the trace 3 times, checking her work with the kind of meticulous redundancy she applied to anything where being wrong was not an option. The encoding signature held. The timeline held. The routing architecture held. She sat in the dark operations room at 11:47 at night with the evidence of her sister's betrayal mapped across 4 monitors, and she felt the stone in her chest arrive at its final position. Not heavier, not lighter, just settled, the way something settles when it reaches the bottom. She had a choice. She had, technically, several choices. She could close the analysis, wipe the session logs, say nothing, and give Tessa whatever window remained before someone else found it. She could send the findings to Carver and let the organizational machinery decide what happened. She could take the information to Lucian directly and watch whatever thin, unspoken thing had been developing between them over the past weeks get recontextualized as professional obligation. Or she could sit with it for the night, alone, and think about what her sister had done to her. What Tessa had been doing for months, maybe longer, while Raina spent her nights auditing pharmaceutical servers and eating granola bars for dinner and covering gaps and filling holes and managing the endless quiet damage of loving someone who treated that love as a resource. She sat with it. She sat with it for a long time, in the dark, in the silence that the estate manufactured so effortlessly, and she felt something harden in her chest that she didn't have a precise name for. Then she opened a secure message and typed Lucian, name in the recipient field. She typed 4 lines. She read them back. She changed one word. She hit send. She heard his footsteps on the stairs 14 minutes later. She knew his footsteps by now, the specific rhythm of someone who moves with the same deliberate economy they bring to everything. And then he was in the doorway, jacket, bare feet, the look of a man who had been awake but not at work, which was a version of him she hadn't seen before. He looked at the screens. He looked at her. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through it methodically and without softening. The pipeline irregularity, the vendor access anomaly, the encoding signature, the routing architecture, the receiving structure on the other end, and what it implied about the entity collecting the data. He stood behind her shoulder, and she felt his stillness become something else. Not the calm temperature stillness she'd learned over weeks, but something charged underneath. The specific quality of a man who is encountering information he's been preparing for without knowing he was preparing for it. When she reached the encoding signature, she stopped. "You know whose that is," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd understood the implication before she said it, because he was several sentences ahead, like always. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silence got its own texture. Then, "How long have you known?" 2 hours? "And you sent me the message?" "Yes." She felt him shift behind her, Mom. Not movement exactly, more the sense of a change in pressure. "You could have not sent it." "I know." That would have been the easier choice. "Easier isn't the right metric," she said. She turned to look at him then, and up close in the low light he looked less like the man from her apartment, less like the architecture of power and cold patience, and more like someone who was carrying something very heavy and had been doing it so long he'd forgotten other people could see the weight. "She's been selling information to someone who is building toward a move against your organization. Whatever they're planning, the data she's been providing would give them a significant operational advantage. This isn't just a debt situation anymore." "No," he said. "It isn't." His voice was very quiet, different from the dinner table quiet or the meeting room quiet, something stripped down. "What do you need to find out who's on the receiving end?" 48 hours and access to the North Wing servers. The North Wing, the restricted access, the area Mrs. Holt had pointed to on the first day with her precise, unreadable tone. She watched him process the request, the access she was asking for against the need she was presenting against whatever calculus he ran about trust and risk, and what it meant that she'd sent him the message instead of sitting on it. "I'll have the access ready by 6, he said. He straightened. He moved toward the door. He stopped in the frame, the same door frame where he'd stood on so many evenings at the edge of the room, conducting business, and she noticed, from across the room, that his hand was closed at his side in a way that looked involuntary. "Raina." She looked at him. Whatever Tessa's involvement, whatever she's done. He stopped. He didn't finish it. It wasn't a reassurance. It wasn't a threat. It was the beginning of a sentence he apparently decided didn't need completing, which told her more than the sentence would have. He left. She turned back to the screens. She stared at the data routing map, the architecture of her sister's betrayal laid out across the monitors in clean, precise lines. And she felt the last warm thing between her and Tessa cool and go still, the way a fire goes when the fuel is finally, completely gone. She had spent her whole life cleaning up Tessa's wreckage. This was the last time. Whatever came next, Whoever was on the other end of that data pipeline, whatever they were building toward, whatever her sister had traded for money and a feeling of safety that was almost certainly already spent, Raina was not going to be the one left standing in the ruins this time. She was going to be the one burning them. She didn't sleep. She worked through the night with the North Wing access Lucien had granted, moving through server layers with the focused precision of someone who understood that speed and accuracy were not opposites if you were disciplined enough to hold both at once. The North Wing architecture was older than the East Wing systems, built on a different framework, patched repeatedly over years in the way that organizations patch things when they're growing faster than their infrastructure can keep up with. It had the texture of something that had been added to rather than designed. Layers of decisions made by different people at different times, not always talking to each other. She mapped it in 3 hours. By 4 in the morning, she had the full picture of the receiving structure on the other end of Tessa's data pipeline. She sat back and looked at it. The organization collecting Lucien's operational intelligence was not a rival crime syndicate. It was not a competing network trying to carve out territory. It was a federal task force, a joint operation between two agencies, running under a cover designation that she'd seen referenced in one of the archived court documents she'd found during her first research session weeks ago. The second investigation that had closed without charges in 2022. It hadn't closed because it ran out of evidence. It had closed because it went underground and started building something longer. Tessa hadn't been selling information to Lucien's enemies. Tessa had been feeding a federal operation. Raina pressed her palms flat against the desk and stared at the screen and thought about what that meant with the specific, grinding precision of someone forcing their brain to stay functional when every instinct was screaming at it to shut down. It meant Tessa had been approached, or had approached them. One or the other. She couldn't determine which from the data, not yet. It meant the $3 million debt might not have been careless gambling. It might have been the mechanism. Run up a debt large enough to force proximity to the organization, then leverage that proximity to collect what the task force needed. Whether Tessa had walked in with that plan or been recruited into it midway through, the outcome was the same. Raina was now inside a federal investigation, employed by its target. In possession of the intelligence architecture the investigation had spent months building, and she had sent Lucien Moretti a message at 11:47 last night telling him exactly what she'd found. She thought about Tessa's text. Don't make a decision without talking to me first. She hadn't been managing her. She'd been trying to warn her, badly, obliquely, in the only way Tessa apparently knew how to warn people, which was insufficient and too late and wrapped in enough self-preservation that it barely registered as warning at all. But she had tried. Raina's throat tightened. She swallowed against it and made herself keep thinking, because stopping to feel this was a luxury she categorically could not afford in the next few hours. Lucien needed to know what she'd found. That was the agreement. That was the framework she'd been operating under since the night she'd signed Weiss's modified contract in an office that smelled like stale coffee and hard decisions. But telling Lucien what she'd found meant handing him the architecture of a federal operation. It meant giving him the ability to dismantle it, expose its informants, identify its personnel, and neutralize it before it could move. That was not an abstract consequence. That had specific human consequences. People working that investigation, people who had spent months building it, would be in danger. Tessa was in danger. She sat in the dark operations room with the data on 4 monitors and felt the ground shift under her in a way that was different from every previous shift. This wasn't the floor dropping out the way it had when Lucien had first said $3 million in her apartment. That had been shock moving through her like something physical. This was the specific vertigo of understanding that every decision she'd made in the past 6 weeks had been, in some structural sense, wrong. Not because of bad judgment, but because she'd been solving a puzzle with pieces missing, and the missing pieces changed the entire shape of the image. She needed to talk to Tessa. She needed to do it before Lucien came back for the findings she'd promised him by morning. She pulled out her personal phone, not the organizational device, her own, and opened the text thread with the prepaid number. She typed, "I know what you've been doing. I need to talk to you. Not a warning. I have the architecture. Call me now." She stared at it for 30 seconds. She sent it. Then she locked the analysis behind 3 additional encryption layers and went upstairs to wait. The call came at 5:18. "Raina, don't." Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, and she let it stay hard because hard was what she had right now, and softening it would have been dishonest. I found the pipeline. I found the routing. I found the receiving structure. I know who you're working with. Silence on the line. She could hear Tessa breathing, the particular rhythm of someone who has been caught and is running options in real time and finding them all closed. How long? Tessa said finally. Hours. Does he know? Not yet. Another silence. Then quietly, Raina, you can't tell him. Tell me why I shouldn't. Because they're close. Tessa's voice shifted, the bright surface of it gone, something raw underneath that Raina hadn't heard in years, maybe ever. The voice Tessa used when she had nothing left to perform. They're 8 weeks out from having enough. 8 weeks, and then they move and it's over and you walk away from this clean. If he finds out, you're exposed. The operation is exposed. Yes. People get hurt. Yes. A beat. Including you, Raina. If this comes apart now, you're inside it. You've been working for him for 6 weeks. That is a material relationship with an ongoing federal target. You have to think about, don't tell me what I have to think about, Raina said, and her voice went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with restraint and everything to do with the cold arriving. You put me here. You borrowed $3 million from a man you were already running an operation against, and then you disappeared and left me holding it. You sent me a message telling me not to make a decision without talking to you, and when I tried to call you back, the line was dead. You let me walk into this building and take this job and do this work for 6 weeks without telling me what I was walking into. I couldn't tell you. If you'd known. If I'd known, I wouldn't have come. That's why you didn't tell me. She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for 3 seconds and breathed through her nose. Was any of it real? The debt. Were you actually in trouble, or was it the debt is real? Tessa said it quickly, too quickly. I made bad choices, Raina. That part isn't a lie. I genuinely owe to the same organization you've been informing against for 14 weeks. Tessa went quiet. Did you borrow the money to get access to him? Raina said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 5. It started as a real debt, Tessa said finally. And then someone came to me with an offer and the math was different. If I help them build the case, the debt gets managed as part of the arrangement. I don't go to prison for the financial fraud charges they were already building against me for the casino money. It wasn't, Raina, I wasn't trying to, you were trying to save yourself. Raina said it without heat, just fact. That's what you always do, Tessa. You make the move that keeps you alive and you figure out the blast radius afterward. A long pause. Then, very quietly, I tried to warn you. Too late. I know. Raina stood up from the chair she'd been sitting in and walked to the window. Dawn was starting to arrive at the edges of the sky. Not light yet, just the first erasure of darkness, the world going from black to the deep charcoal gray of earliest morning. The grounds below were empty and still and covered in frost. 8 weeks, she said. 8 weeks. And they're solid. The case is solid. If you can hold it together for 8 weeks, and if I tell him nothing, and he finds out another way? Silence. He's not stupid, Tessa. He's 7 steps ahead of every conversation he's in. If I tell him I have findings and deliver something incomplete, he'll know it's incomplete. Then be careful. You're good at this. You're the best. Don't. She felt something lurch in her chest at the flattery, the specific, tired recognition of a move she'd been watching for 30 years. Tessa reaching for the compliment when the logic ran out. Tessa finding the version of things that made her the one being protected rather than the one doing damage. I need to think. Raina, I'll call you back. She ended the call. She stood at the window and watched the frost in thought. She was not someone who had ever operated in moral ambiguity without discomfort. That was perhaps the most essential truth about her. She thought in systems, in clean architecture, in the satisfaction of correct solutions to well-defined problems. She had always found ambiguity expensive. It cost more processing power than clarity and produced worse outcomes. This was the most ambiguous position she had ever stood in, She was 6 weeks into a contract with a man who, by federal assessment, ran a criminal organization of significant scale. She had been doing genuine work, real, technical, effective work that protected that organization's infrastructure. She had identified and removed an internal asset of a federal investigation without knowing that was what she was doing. She had sent the man she was contractually obligated to last night a message outlining the intelligence architecture his investigators had spent months building. She had not yet delivered the most important part of what she'd found. She had approximately 2 hours before Lucien came to the operations room expecting that delivery. She went back to the desk and opened the analysis and sat with it, and thought about the two versions of the next 2 hours and where each of them went. Version 1. She told him everything. She gave him the full picture, the federal task force, the operation structure, the timeline, Tessa's role. He would have the information he needed to dismantle it. People would get hurt. Tessa would be exposed. The investigation would collapse. And Raina would have crossed a line that was not symbolic but specific. She would have actively compromised a federal investigation, which was the kind of thing that did not wash off. Version 2. She told him part of it. She gave him a version that was technically accurate in its components, but strategically incomplete. The data leak, the routing, the receiving entity framed as a private intelligence operation rather than what it was. Enough to seem like full disclosure, not enough to expose the federal structure. By 8 weeks, let the investigation close. Walk out the other side of it, with her exposure manageable. Version 2 required her to deceive Lucien Moretti to his face, the man who was several sentences ahead of every conversation. The man who had, she had observed over 6 weeks, a specific and refined intolerance for incomplete information. She thought about his hand closed at his side in the doorframe last night. She thought about the way he'd said her name. She closed the analysis file. She heard his footsteps on the stairs at 6:43. She heard them stop outside the operations room door. She heard the door open. He came in wearing the same clothes as last night. He hadn't slept either. His face had the flat, finished quality of a man who had spent the dark hours making peace with information he'd already received and was now prepared to act on whatever came next. He looked at her, and the screens, and the coffee she hadn't drunk. "What did you find?" he said. She turned to face him. She had made her decision somewhere in the last 20 minutes without quite knowing when, the way decisions sometimes make themselves while you're still pretending to deliberate. "Sit down." He didn't sit. He never sat for briefings, always stood, always at the slight angle that kept the door in his peripheral vision. But he moved to the workstation and positioned himself where he could see the screens. She walked him through it. The routing architecture, the receiving structure, the federal designation. She said it cleanly and without cushioning, because cushioning it would have been an insult to both of them, and she was past the point of insulting either of them. She watched his face as she spoke. The stillness that arrived was different from his usual stillness. This one had a quality of absolute zero to it, the specific temperature of a man who has reached the limit of what he will process externally. When she stopped speaking, the room was completely quiet. "How long has the investigation been running?" he said. "The cover designation traces to 2022, but the intelligence collection phase started 14 weeks ago when the data leak began. And your sister has been the primary source. She was apparently approached and offered resolution of her financial situation in exchange for cooperation. The debt gave her access to your network. She was placed. She was recruited from an existing position. I can't determine which from the data." He was quiet for a long time. His hands were at his sides. She watched his jaw, the subtle line of tension that ran along it, the way it appeared and then was controlled back into stillness. "You found this last night?" "Yes." "You sent me the initial message last night?" "Yes." "But not this part." The sentence sat between them. She felt her own heartbeat in her ears. "I needed to confirm it before I brought it to you." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The quality of attention that he reserved for things that mattered, the kind that felt like being disassembled and examined component by component. "That's not all of it." She held his gaze, said nothing. "You contacted her." He said it quietly, not an accusation the way it might have sounded from someone else, more like a man stating the coordinates of where they were so they could agree on the map. "After you found it, you contacted Tessa before you came to me." The silence was very loud. "Yes," she said. Something shifted in his expression. She had spent 6 weeks learning the vocabulary of his face, and she read this one. It was not anger, not quite. It was the specific look of a man who has extended something careful and had it returned to him bent. What did she tell you? 8 weeks. They're 8 weeks from having enough to move. And she asked you to hold it. Yes. He took a breath, slow, controlled, through his nose. And instead you told me. Yes? Why? The question was simple. It had a simple answer and a complicated one, and both of them were true, and she was tired of lying by omission to everyone in her life, including herself. Because it was the right thing to do, she said. Not for you. Because I'm not interested in being the thing that gets moved around the board anymore. By Tessa or by anyone else. I'm done being someone else's decision. Lucien was very still. Then he said, "Leave the estate." The world tilted. What? I need you to leave the estate for the next 24 hours. Take your personal belongings. Mrs. Holt will arrange accommodation in the city. His voice was entirely without effect. Not cold, not warm, simply functioning. What happens in the next 24 hours is not something you should be present for. If you move against the operation, what happens in the next 24 hours, he repeated, and the repetition was the only emphasis he used, and it was sufficient, is not something you should be present for. A pause. You have done the job I contracted you for. You have done it exceptionally. What comes next is mine to manage. She stared at him. The implications of what comes next arranged themselves in her mind with horrible clarity. The federal task force. The 8 weeks. Tessa somewhere with a prepaid phone. She's my sister, she said. I know. He held her gaze, and there was something in his, not apology, not that, but the specific expression of a man who is making a decision he understands the full weight of. She is also someone who has been operating against my organization for 14 weeks and has caused material damage to people and structures under my protection. Those two things are simultaneously true. If you touch her, leave the estate, Raina. Lucien, I am not asking. The sentence was very quiet. It was the quietest thing he had ever said to her, and it landed harder than anything louder would have. He turned away from her and walked to the far end of the operations room, putting his back to her, and she understood that the conversation was over in the specific physical way of a door closing. She stood there for 5 seconds with her hands at her sides and her chest doing something complicated and wrong. Then she went upstairs and packed her bag. She was in the car, at the gate, when her phone lit up. Not the prepaid number. Her own. Tessa calling from an unknown number, which meant she'd burned the prepaid and found another way. She picked up. He knows, Tessa said immediately. No preamble. The bright performance completely gone, her voice stripped to something Raina had not heard before. Raw, frightened, the voice of someone who has run out of moves. Raina, he knows. How does he? I told him. Dead silence. Then, you told him. Yes. Another silence, longer, with a different quality. Raina heard Tessa breathing on the other end of the line. Fast, shallow, the breathing of someone who is processing the specific pain of being betrayed by the one person they never expected it from, which was, Raina understood, with the full, terrible clarity of someone seeing themselves from outside for the first time, exactly what Tessa had done to her. I trusted you, Tessa said, barely above a whisper. I know, Raina said. I'm sorry. She ended the call. The car moved through the gate and onto the highway, and the estate disappeared behind the tree line. And Raina sat in the back seat with her bag at her feet and her hands flat on her thighs, and felt the last remaining thread between her and the life she'd come from go. The hotel room was a rectangle of beige and silence. Mrs. Holt had arranged it. A mid-tier business hotel 40 minutes from the estate, clean and anonymous, and exactly the kind of place where nothing happened. Raina sat on the edge of the bed with her bag unopened at her feet and her phone in her hand and stared at the wall and thought about the thread she'd felt go taut and then snap in the back of the car. She'd been sitting there for 11 minutes when her phone rang. Unknown number, different from the one Tessa had used an hour ago. She picked up. Miss Mercer? A man's voice. Flat, official, the specific cadence of someone who had rehearsed the opening of this conversation. My name is Agent Reeves. I think you know why I'm calling. Her hand tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? We've had it for some time. We've been patient about using it. A pause. You told him about the operation. She said nothing. Miss Mercer, what you did this morning constitutes interference with a federal investigation. That is a serious... I'm aware of what it constitutes. Then you understand the position you're in. She stood up from the bed. She moved to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. Gray concrete, a few cars, the flat winter light of late morning. What do you want? We want to know what he knows. Specifically, what did you show him, how much detail, and what was his response? And in exchange. In exchange, your cooperation is documented and your exposure is significantly reduced. She thought about Lucien turning his back to her in the operations room. She thought about his voice, I'm not asking, and the specific quality of that sentence, how it had landed not as a threat, but as a closing. A man putting a door between her and what came next because he understood what came next, and she didn't. He knows about the task force designation, she said. He knows about the routing architecture and the data pipeline. He knows Tessa's role. Silence on the line. She heard the agent shift, the small adjustment of someone recalibrating. How long ago did you tell him? Approximately 4 hours. 4. He stopped. She heard something in the background, voices, rapid, the controlled urgency of a room that has just received bad news and is moving. Ms. Mercer, we need you to go back to the estate. You want me to We need eyes inside. He's going to move against the operation, and we need to know the direction before he does. If you go back, you're a cooperating witness. Full immunity. Everything that happened in the last 6 weeks becomes documented cooperation. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. You want me to spy on him? We want you to do what you've been doing. Observe. Report. He trusted me. He is a criminal operating a network responsible for significant... I know what he is. She said it quietly. I've known what he is since the first night. Then help us finish it. She stood at the window and felt the weight of the stone that had been in her chest since the night 3 men had walked through her door, and she recognized, standing there in a beige hotel room with a federal agent on the phone, that the stone had changed again. It wasn't Tessa's weight anymore. It wasn't fear's weight. It was the weight of a choice that had no clean side, no correct answer, no version that left her hands entirely unbloodied. She thought about 8 weeks. She thought about Tessa's voice. I trusted you, stripped of everything except the raw center of it. She thought about Lucien in the low light of the operations room, the hand closed at his side, the way he'd said her name. I'll call you back, she said. Ms. Mercer, we need... She ended the call. She stood at the window for 90 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of the hotel room and took the elevator to the lobby and got into the car that was still waiting at the curb because Mrs. Holt's arrangements were always thorough. Take me back, she said. The driver didn't ask questions. He pulled out of the lot and headed for the highway, and Raina sat in the back and watched the city give way to the highway, give way to the winter trees, and tried to build a plan out of the components she had. She had the federal agent's number. She had the full analysis locked behind her encryption on the operations room system. She had 6 weeks of detailed knowledge of the estate's layout, security rotation, access architecture, and the specific rhythms of how Lucien Moretti ran his world. And she understood now with a clarity that would have embarrassed her 6 weeks ago, the specific and inconvenient reality of what she felt about the man she was driving back toward. Not as leverage, not as information, just as a fact she was finally done pretending wasn't there. The gates came into view. The driver punched in the code and the gates swung open, and Raina was 200 meters down the drive when she saw the first car she didn't recognize. Black, no plates visible from this angle, parked at the side of the approach road in the space between the tree line and the gravel. She sat forward. There were 2 more. One positioned near the east entrance, engine running. One at the far end of the building, barely visible around the corner of the stone wall. Stop the car, she said. The driver stopped. She was out before he finished braking, her bag left on the seat, moving across the frost-hardened lawn toward the east entrance at an angle that kept the parked car in her peripheral vision. The men in it hadn't moved. They were watching the building. She pulled out her phone and called the operations room direct line. Carver picked up on the second ring. Mercer, you're supposed to be... There are vehicles on the approach road. At least 3. Not your people. A beat. She heard him move. Heard a door open. How many in each? Can't confirm. The east car has 2 visible in front. When did you... I just arrived. Carver, what's happening in there? It's been a complicated morning. His voice had the clipped precision of someone doing 3 things at once. Stay on the line. Don't approach the building from the east. She changed direction, moving along the tree line toward the north end of the estate, keeping low and fast on the frozen ground. The cold hit her face and her hands, and she ignored it. Her shoes were wrong for this. Flat soles, no grip. And she felt her footing skid twice on the frost, but caught herself without slowing. She heard it before she reached the north corner. Not an explosion. Something smaller, sharper. Glass. Then a shout, cut off. Then 3 sounds that she classified correctly and immediately because some knowledge is too specific to misidentify. Gunshots. She pressed flat against the stone wall of the building, back against the cold, and breathed. Once, twice. Her heart was doing something violent in her chest, and she felt it in her throat and her wrists, and she made herself stay still for 5 full seconds and count what she knew. Armed people in vehicles outside. Armed people inside. The estate's security team was active. Carver was in the operations room, which meant not incapacitated. Lucien was somewhere in the building, the north wing, probably, his private offices. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carver. North corridor, breach. Get to the safe room, east stairwell, 3rd floor, panel behind the mirror, code 7741. She read it twice. Then she moved. The east entrance door was unlocked. Someone had propped it, which was either Carver or very bad news, and she went through it low and fast and pressed into the shadow of the entryway. The ground floor hallway was empty, but wrong. She could feel the wrongness without seeing it. The lights had gone to emergency backup, the warm amber of the main system replaced by the flat white of the secondary, which threw shadows in different places and made the familiar geography of the building feel slightly off register. She heard footsteps above her. Running. 2 sets, then a third, moving fast across the 2nd floor. She went up the east stairwell. The 2nd floor landing was empty, but one of the hallway mirrors was cracked, a long diagonal split that had no business being there. She didn't stop to look at it. She went up to the 3rd floor. She smelled it before she saw it. Copper and something acrid. She turned the corner of the 3rd floor hallway and found Lucien. He was on the floor with his back against the wall, left hand pressed to his right side. The white of his shirt gone dark and wrong from the shoulder down. A man was slumped 12 feet away who was not getting up. Lucien had a gun in his right hand and his eyes were open and tracking, and when he saw her, his expression moved through 3 things in under a second. Recognition, something that looked like relief, and was immediately controlled back into nothing. And then the focused assessment of a man doing damage triage. "You came back," he said. His voice was even. She didn't know how his voice was even. She crossed the distance between them and went to her knees on the floor beside him. "How bad?" "Through and through, I think." He said, "I think," like a man who had assessed his own injuries in the past and understood the margin of error in self-assessment. "Safe room, we need to... How many are in the building?" 4 came in through the north breach. Carver's team is handling 2 of them. The other 2 are moving up. She heard them. Below, heavy footsteps moving with the particular cadence of people who know where they're going and aren't concerned about who hears them coming. Because when you don't care about being heard, you've already made a calculation about the opposition. "Up," she said, and got her arm under his. He was heavier than she expected, and the dead weight of someone managing serious pain is different from dead weight. It has resistance and cooperation in unpredictable alternation, the body negotiating between what it needs to do and what it's capable of. She got him upright against the wall and felt the warm wet of his blood immediately on her hand and her jacket, and she moved that information to the back of her brain and kept moving. "Left," he said. "The mirror." She got them down the hall. Lucien was walking, barely, with his weight shifted hard to her shoulder, his right hand still on the gun, his jaw set in the rigid line of someone who has made a deal with their own pain. She reached the mirror. She ran her free hand along the frame edge and found the panel inset. A pressure release recessed. She hit it. The mirror swung inward. She got him through. The safe room was concrete and low-ceilinged, maybe 12 by 10, with a secondary power source running a single overhead light and a bench along one wall that had a basic medical kit bolted beneath it. She lowered him to the bench. He let her, which told her more about the blood loss than any visual assessment. She got the mirror panel closed. She heard the footsteps reach the hallway outside. Slow now, deliberate, moving door to door. She got the medical kit open. She worked on his side in the specific, concentrated silence of someone who had taken a wilderness first aid course at 19 as a required university module and had never expected to use it, understanding in real time the gap between knowing something and doing it on a person she cut the thought off. She packed the wound with the materials she had, and he made one sound. One, low and involuntary, a breath forced out through his teeth, and then was silent. His hand had moved from the gun to the edge of the bench. She could see the tendons in it from the grip. "Keep pressure," she said. "I know how to keep pressure." He kept pressure. She sat back on her heels and looked at him in the flat white light, and thought about the hotel room and the federal agent and the phone call and the 40-minute drive back and the feeling that had moved through her when she'd seen the cars on the approach road and understood before she'd understood consciously that something had gone wrong and he was inside it. "You came back," he said again. Quieter. "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him. Blood on her hands, his blood, the smell of copper and cold concrete around them. The footsteps still moving in the hallway outside in a pattern that was working toward them systematically. This was not a moment for anything other than what was true. "Because you turned your back and I got in the car, and the whole drive I kept thinking about that. And then I saw the cars and I stopped thinking about it and just came." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were steady on her. Not the analytical distance of his usual attention, something more direct than that, present in a way that had no armor over it. "That's not a strategically sound reason." "I know." "You could have stayed in the hotel." "I know." Outside the mirror panel, the footsteps stopped. She heard low voices, two of them, conferring. She watched the panel, and her hand went to the floor beside her without her thinking about it, and Lucienne shifted the gun from the bench to her hand in one movement, the transfer of it clean and deliberate and without discussion, the language of two people who had moved past words into something faster. She held the gun. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with the distant, factual clarity of someone observing themselves from a slight remove. Her hands were not shaking. The gun was cold. She knew where the safety was. The voices outside went quiet. She felt Lucien's hand cover hers. Not the gun hand, the other one, still bloody, flat against the concrete floor. He pressed it briefly, once, and released it. She didn't look at him. She watched the panel. 30 seconds. 40. Then she heard it, running from further down the hall, and Carver's voice, commanding and very clear, and a crash of something large hitting a wall, and then silence that was different from the preceding silence because it had an exhale in it, the exhale of something that has been under extreme pressure releasing. Her phone buzzed. "Carver, clear, come out." She let the breath out of her chest in a long, unsteady stream. She set the gun on the floor. She turned to Lucien. His color was not good, the kind of pale that sits under skin and makes everything above it look temporary. But his eyes were sharp and on her, and he had the look of a man who has survived the worst moment of the night and is already running calculations on what it means. "Carver," she said. "I heard." He made to stand. "Don't." She stood herself. "I'll get Carver. You stay." "Raina, you've been shot," she said, flat. "Stay." He stayed. She thought she saw something in his expression that was as close to the unguarded truth of him as she had ever seen. Not soft exactly, but open in the way that pain sometimes opens people against their will, strips the constructed surface, and leaves what's actually there. She opened the panel. Carver was in the hallway with two of his team, and the specific posture of a man who has been in active contact and is now performing the controlled decompression of returning to operational assessment. He looked at her. Her hands, her jacket, the blood that was visibly not her own. "He's stable," she said before he could ask. "Through and through, right side. He needs a doctor, not a hospital." "We have someone." He was already moving, already gesturing to his team. The vehicles outside. Whose were they? Carver's jaw worked. That's the conversation we're going to need to have. Tell me now. He looked at her. The receiving organization your analysis identified. They move faster than 8 weeks. She felt it land. The federal task force. Not waiting for the case to build. Moving now. Not a legal action. Not the organized infrastructure of an arrest operation with warrants and procedure. Something faster and less official. They weren't here to arrest him. No. Carver said it simply. They were not here to arrest him. She stood in the third-floor hallway of the estate and felt the full shape of the betrayal she had been carrying rearrange itself one final time. Not Tessa's betrayal. Something larger. The operation that had been presented to her as a federal investigation with a legal endpoint and a clean timeline had sent armed men to a private residence without badges or warrants or any of the procedural architecture that separated it from the thing it was supposed to be opposing. 8 weeks. There had never been 8 weeks. Who gave the order? She said. Carver shook his head. That's above what I know. Then I need to find out. She turned back to the safe room. Lucien was in the doorway now. He hadn't stayed, of course he hadn't stayed, leaning on the frame with his right hand pressed to his side and his eyes on her. And the look on his face when she turned was the look of a man who has been listening and has caught up to where she is. You think it was Reeves? He said. She looked at him. He called me at the hotel. He knew I'd told you. He wanted me to go back in as an informant. She paused. I didn't agree. But someone gave the order to move before I'd responded either way, which means the decision to escalate was already made before they called me. The call was about containment, not recruitment. Lucien was very still. They wanted to know what you'd told me. They wanted to know how much damage control they needed. She met his eyes. Reeves isn't running a federal investigation, or if he is, that's not all he's running. The silence in the hallway was very complete. Carver's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his face did something that it didn't usually do. A small, involuntary movement, the face of someone receiving information that recalibrates the entire evening. He looked up at Raina. Your sister is outside the gate, he said. The world went very still. She came here, Raina said. She's asking for you. Says she has something. Says it can't wait. Carver looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at Raina. She thought about Tessa's voice on the phone. I trusted you. The raw center of it, stripped of performance, the voice Tessa used when she had nothing left to manage. She thought about a woman who had borrowed $3 million, or had it borrowed in her name, or had used the debt as a key to open a door. She needed opened, who had run a years-long parallel life that Raina hadn't seen, hadn't looked for, had chosen in her careful and deliberate way not to examine too closely. She thought about the cars on the approach road, the men who had come without badges. Tessa was outside the gate, with something that couldn't wait. Raina looked at Lucien, at the pale, sharp, blood-stained reality of him in the doorframe, the man she had spent 6 weeks mapping and had ended up inside the map of. And she felt the last version of herself that would have handed this decision to someone else dissolve completely, quietly, like smoke in a draft. I'll go, she said. Raina. His voice was low and she heard the thing in it he wasn't saying. I know. She looked at him directly. I know what she is. I know what she's done. A beat. She's still my sister. He held her gaze. Something moved behind those pale eyes. Not the recalibration she'd learned to read, not the solved equation steadiness. Something that had no strategy in it at all. Take Carver, he said. She went. The gate was 40 meters down the drive, and she covered it fast in the cold, Carver 2 steps behind her, the winter dark pressing in from the tree line on both sides. She could see the shape of a figure outside the gate from 20 meters out, standing close to the iron bars, not pacing, just standing the way people stand when they have run out of road and know it. She reached the gate. Tessa looked wrong. Not the put-together version that Raina had been carrying in her mental image for the last 6 weeks. The competent, self-directed woman who had apparently been running an operation inside a criminal network while Raina was still trying to understand why she hadn't called back. This version was thinner, pinched with cold and something worse than cold, wearing a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the temperature, her hair down and disordered. She looked the way she'd looked at 23 when the first bad thing had happened and the performance hadn't fully developed yet. Her eyes found Raina through the gate bars and held. "You have to listen to me," Tessa said. Her voice was ragged at the edges. The operation isn't what I was told it was. I found out 2 weeks ago and I've been trying to figure out how to... She stopped. She looked at Carver, then back at Raina. He's been selling the intelligence, the data I was pulling. It wasn't going to a federal case file. It was going to Reeves, and Reeves was selling it to a third party. There is no federal case. There's a man using federal cover to run a private intelligence operation, and I've been his source for 14 weeks, and I didn't know, and when I found out I didn't know who to... She stopped again. Her breath was coming fast and visible in the cold air. "Raina," she said. Her voice cracked on it. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. But right now that doesn't matter, because Reeves knows you're back inside, and he knows his breach team failed, and he is going to..." Tessa didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Raina already knew what came after "he is going to." She'd known it from the moment Carver read his phone in the hallway, and his face did that involuntary thing. Reeves had called her at the hotel to assess exposure. When she'd hung up without committing, he'd sent the breach team as the alternative. The breach team had failed, which meant Reeves was now a man who had deployed armed operatives against a target who was still standing, with a witness who knew exactly what he'd done and why, and the only logical move remaining to him was to eliminate the witness before the witness became testimony. She looked at Tessa through the gate bars, at the thinness of her, the cold, the disordered hair, the cracked voice. She thought about all the things she had spent 6 weeks feeling about her sister, the anger, the specific cold fury of the betrayal, the exhausted grief of someone who has loved a person imperfectly and been loved back even more imperfectly and understands both things at the same time. She put her hand on the gate release. Carver put his hand on her arm. "Mercer, she's not armed," Raina said, "and she came here. She came here because she has nowhere else. I know." She looked at him. "Open the gate, Carver." He held for 2 seconds. Then he released her arm and keyed the gate. Tessa came through. She stopped 2 feet inside the perimeter and looked at Raina with the specific expression of someone who has prepared several versions of an apology and understands, in the moment of delivery, that none of them are adequate. She didn't try any of them. She just stood there in the cold with her breath coming fast and visible and let Raina look at her. "How long have you known about Reeves?" Raina said. 2 weeks. I found an inconsistency in the data routing. The packets weren't going to a federal server architecture. They were going somewhere private. I started tracing it and..." She stopped. "I'm not as good at this as you are. It took me longer than it would have taken you. And when I found it, I panicked because I'd been running this operation for 12 weeks, thinking it was legitimate, and it wasn't, and I'd already..." She stopped again. Her jaw worked. "I'd already sent you the message telling you not to sign with him, because they told me to keep you out of it. They said you'd complicate things. They were right," Raina said. "Yes." Tessa looked at her. "When you called and said you'd told him, I was..." She pressed her lips together. "I was angry. And then I thought about what you said, that you were done being moved around. And I thought about what I'd done to you, all of it. And I realized the only person who had ever actually moved you anywhere was me." She said it flatly. No performance in it. "So I came here because Reeves is going to move fast. And he has more men, and the only information that stops him is what I know about his actual operation, and I'll give it to Lucien Moretti in person if that's what it takes." Raina looked at her sister for a long moment, at the 31-year-old woman who had spent her whole life making decisions at speed with whatever materials were available and dealing with the consequences afterward, which was not a good system, but was the system Tessa had and had always had. And no amount of anger changed the fact that it was also, in its own chaotic way, a kind of courage. "Come inside," Raina said. Lucien was in the operations room when they arrived, seated now. Carver had apparently won that argument, with the estate's physician working on his side and his expression carrying the controlled frustration of a man who found being stationary offensive under any circumstances. He looked up when they came in. He looked at Tessa, and his face did the thing it did. The complete, immediate assessment, the categorization. He said nothing. Tessa met his eyes. She didn't flinch. Raina gave her that. You know who I am, Tessa said. Yes. I have the full architecture of Reeves's operation. Server locations, financial routing, the identity of his buyer, the third party he's been selling your intelligence to. She paused. I'll give you all of it. In exchange, the debt is cleared, not suspended, cleared. And Raina walks out of her contract with full release and no residual exposure. The room was quiet except for the physician working and the faint electronic hum of the equipment. Lucien looked at Tessa for a long moment. Then he looked at Raina. Something passed between them that didn't require words, and Raina felt it in the center of her chest like a hand pressed flat. The debt is already cleared, Lucien said, returning his gaze to Tessa. It was cleared 6 weeks ago when your sister walked through my gate. A pause. Give me the information. Tessa blinked. Something moved across her face that Raina hadn't seen in a very long time. The expression of someone who received something they'd expected to have to fight for and didn't know what to do with the absence of the fight. She sat down across from him and started talking. She talked for 40 minutes. Raina sat at the workstation and cross-referenced every data point Tessa provided against the analysis she'd built over the past weeks, filling in the gaps, confirming the architecture, building the picture from two sides simultaneously. The buyer, the third party Reeves had been selling Lucian's operational intelligence to, was a private security conglomerate operating out of 3 jurisdictions, the kind of entity that occupied the shadow space between legitimate consulting and the services that legitimate consulting firms couldn't officially offer. They'd been building a dossier on Lucian's organization for 18 months, not to take it down, to acquire it. A hostile acquisition of a criminal network executed through intelligence saturation and targeted destabilization. The breach team tonight hadn't been an elimination order. It had been a destabilization strike. Take out the head, fracture the organization, create the vacuum that the conglomerate would then move into. Reeves was their instrument, had been for 2 years. The federal cover, Raina said, still looking at her screens. How deep does it go? Reeves has 2 legitimate colleagues on the task force who don't know what he's doing. The rest of the operation is his private construction. He used the task force's legal architecture as cover for the data collection and kept the actual intelligence stream completely off the official file. Tessa's voice had leveled out as she talked. The crack gone. The performance gone. Just the flat transmission of information by someone who had spent weeks learning it against their will. He recruited me before I went to the task force. I thought I was cooperating with a federal agent. I didn't know until 2 weeks ago that the cooperation was going somewhere private. Lucien had been listening with his eyes on Tessa and his hand maintaining pressure on his side and his expression completely still. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, the 2 legitimate colleagues. Their names are in the file I can get you. Get me the file. Tessa produced a drive from her jacket pocket. She set it on the desk without ceremony. Carver picked it up and slotted it into an isolated workstation, and Raina shifted to pull the contents without connecting it to the main network. Basic protocol. And she did it without being asked because 6 weeks inside this world had made certain instincts automatic. The file was real. She could see it in the first 3 minutes of review. Real and detailed and assembled with the kind of methodical, fear-driven thoroughness that people produce when they've discovered they're in the wrong situation and are building documentation as both insurance and exit strategy. Tessa had been doing this for 2 weeks, quietly, carefully, in whatever margins she had. It's good, Raina said. Lucien nodded once. He looked at Tessa again, and this time the quality of his attention was different. Not the categorizing assessment of the first look, but something that had arrived at a conclusion. Where have you been staying? Various places. You'll stay here tonight. He said it without making it a question. Tomorrow we determine next steps. Tessa looked at him, then at Raina. Raina gave her nothing either way. That was Tessa's decision and Tessa's alone. After a moment, Tessa nodded. The next 6 hours moved in the specific accelerated rhythm of a crisis being systematically dismantled. Carver coordinated with 2 of Lucian's external contacts, people Raina had heard referenced but never met. Voices on secure lines with the clipped efficiency of professionals who operated in the same gray spaces and had specific and reliable capabilities within them. The breach team's vehicles were traced. Two of the four operatives were identified through their equipment to private security firms with documented ties to the conglomerate. That information went somewhere, and Raina did not ask exactly where, because she understood by now that there were parts of this world that ran cleaner without her observing them. Reeves was handled differently. Lucien made one call. Raina was in the room for it and heard one side of it. Lucien's voice, low and even, delivering the content of what they'd compiled with the same temperature he brought to everything. What he was offering Reeves, she understood, was a choice between two versions of the rest of his life. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She heard the silence at the end of it that meant someone on the other end was processing the parameters of a situation they had no exit from. Whatever Reeves agreed to, the call ended without raised voices, and the information that came through Carver's channels over the following 2 hours suggested that the conglomerate's operation had developed a significant internal problem that would occupy them entirely for the foreseeable future. She didn't ask for more detail than that. Dawn came gray and cold through the operations room windows, and Raina sat at her workstation and felt, for the first time since the car ride back from the hotel, the specific physical reality of her own body. The exhaustion in her shoulders, the dried blood stiff on her jacket sleeve, the particular deep tiredness that lives below regular tiredness and takes a different kind of sleep to address. She became aware that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and that her hands, resting on the keyboard, were the hands of someone who had been running on adrenaline for so long that the adrenaline had become the baseline. And now that the immediate crisis was over, the baseline had nothing to sustain it. She heard footsteps and knew them before she turned. Lucien came in with 2 cups of coffee, which surprised her into stillness. She had never seen him carry anything domestic. It was such a specifically ordinary gesture in the specific extraordinariness of the past 12 hours that she didn't know how to arrange her face around it. He set one on the desk beside her without comment and took the chair across the workstation, moving carefully in the way of someone managing a patched wound that the painkillers had made bearable but not absent. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Your sister is asleep," he said. "Good." She wrapped her hands around the coffee. "The conglomerate?" "Handled." "Handled how?" He looked at her steadily. "Handled in a way that makes continuing their interest in this organization significantly unappealing." She accepted that. "And Reeves?" "Reeves has provided a full documented account of the operation to the 2 legitimate task force colleagues. He'll be dealing with the consequences of that for the next several years and will not have the bandwidth for anything else." "You gave him to the task force?" "The 2 legitimate members of it, yes." He paused. "It was cleaner." She thought about that. She thought about the architecture of it, using the legitimate law enforcement structure to neutralize the person who'd been corrupting it, which was both practically efficient and carried a specific, deliberate message about where the lines were. That was smart. It was accurate, he said, which was, she had learned, the distinction he made. Accuracy over cleverness, because cleverness required an audience and accuracy only required being right. They drank their coffee in the quiet of the early morning. Outside the window, the frost on the grounds was turning faintly gold at the edges as the sun came up somewhere behind the clouds. The estate was silent in the specific way it was silent after something large had moved through it. Not the cultivated silence of normal mornings, but the silence of a space that had absorbed something and was settling. "I need to tell you something," Raina said. He looked at her. "When Reeves called me at the hotel, when he offered immunity for cooperation, I was on the window for about 90 seconds. She said it straight. I considered it. He was quiet. "I'm telling you because I told you I would tell you things, and because you should know the full picture of last night." "What moved you off it?" he said. She thought about the honest answer, about the parking lot and the winter light, and the federal agent's voice, and the 90 seconds at the window, and the thing that had finally moved her feet to the door. "I was tired of making decisions based on what I was afraid of. The whole reason I was standing in that hotel room was because I'd been making decisions based on fear for 6 weeks. Fear of the consequences of Tessa's choices. Fear of what happens if I don't cooperate with you. Fear of what I might actually be choosing if I stopped pretending I wasn't choosing anything." She paused. "I came back because I wanted to come back. That was the first decision I'd made in 6 weeks that belonged entirely to me." Lucien set his coffee down. He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention and none of the armor over it, which she recognized as the same version of him she'd seen in the safe room, the pain-stripped, unguarded version. Except now there was no pain doing the stripping. It was just him. And now I'm sitting in your operations room with dried blood on my jacket, drinking coffee at 6 in the morning, and I still don't have a clear sense of what my life looks like from here. She looked at him. But I'm not afraid of that. That's new. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the contract. What about it? The terms as they stand are no longer applicable. The debt structure that created them doesn't exist anymore. You're not here under obligation. He held her gaze. You haven't been for some time. You know that. She did know that. She'd known it for weeks. The moment the debt became a suspended theoretical rather than an active pressure, the moment the work became something she was choosing each morning rather than something she was locked into. She'd known, and she'd kept working, and she'd told herself it was because the work was interesting, and she was already here and there was no clean exit point, and those things were true, but they weren't the complete truth. What are you saying? I'm saying the choice is yours. Completely. No residual structure, no obligation, no consequence either way. He said it with the specific flatness of someone who means it and understands that meaning it is the only version that has any value. You can walk out of this building today with everything I owe you. Clearance of your sister's debt, documented, full compensation for the 6 weeks, and a reference that will open any technical security door in the country. She looked at him. And if I don't walk out, then you stay. And we work out what that looks like when neither of us is operating under duress. The morning light was coming through the window properly now, pale winter gold falling across the desk, and the screens, and the coffee cups, and the dried blood on her sleeve. She looked at it and thought about her apartment, the worn armchair, the 4th floor hallway that smelled like old cooking, the specific acoustic texture of a city that never fully slept. She thought about what it had felt like to lock that door every morning and check it twice, building small certainties against the large uncertainty of everything she couldn't control. She thought about what certainty actually cost. I need 3 days, she said. He raised an eyebrow, slight, the smallest movement. 4. To go back to my apartment, pack properly this time, talk to my thesis advisor in person, settle my affairs like an adult who is making a deliberate choice rather than someone who packed a single suitcase in 2 days because they had no other option. She met his eyes. And to spend time with my sister before she disappears again, which she will, but I'd like to do it on my own terms. Something shifted in his expression. Not the micro-recalibration she'd cataloged over weeks. Something slower, warmer, the quality of a man who has spent years in a world where things were taken rather than offered, and is encountering an offer and doesn't quite know yet how to hold it without gripping too hard. 3 days? He said. 3 days. He nodded. Once. Take the car. She found Tessa in one of the East Wing guest rooms 3 hours later, awake and sitting on the edge of the bed with her jacket still on and her shoes still on, the posture of someone who hadn't committed to being anywhere yet. She looked up when Raina came in. The two of them looked at each other in the morning light, and all of it was there between them, 30 years of it. The whole accumulated weight of love and damage, and the specific exhausted intimacy of two people who know each other too well to pretend. Raina sat down on this bed beside her. Not close, not far. I'm not going to tell you it's okay, Raina said. I know. What you did? The whole operation, running it without telling me, letting me walk into this building blind, that's not something I can make small. It did real damage. I know. Tessa's voice was quiet. Stripped. The morning after voice. I told myself I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. I know the difference now. I've been learning it for 6 weeks. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going to stay here? I'm going to come back, yes? Because of him. Raina thought about the honest answer again. She'd been doing that a lot in the last 12 hours, reaching for accuracy instead of the softened version. Partly, and partly because the work is real and I'm good at it, and this is the first time in my life I've had the resources to be as good at it as I actually am. She paused. And partly because I spent 7 years making my choices based on what you needed, and I'm done with that. Whatever I do from here, it's mine. Tessa absorbed that. She sat with it in the specific way of someone who has received something they deserved and are deciding how to carry it. "I'm going to leave," she said. "After today. I have money. The arrangement with Reeves covered expenses I can keep, and the rest I'll figure out. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not going to keep being the thing that happens to you, Raina." Raina looked at her sister, at the thin, cold-stripped reality of her. She thought about the version of Tessa she'd been carrying for years, the reckless one, the one who took and disappeared and called when she needed something. And she thought about the woman who had spent 2 weeks quietly building a documentation file when she found out she'd been used, who had come to a dangerous man's gate in the cold with a drive in her pocket because it was the only thing she had to offer, and she'd offered it anyway. People were not single versions of themselves. She had spent years insisting that Tessa was, because the single version was easier to be angry at. "Where will you go?" Raina said. "I haven't decided." "Okay." She paused. "Call me when you get there. Not a prepaid. Your actual number." Tessa looked at her. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, not quite, but the specific undoing of a tension that had been held for a long time. "Okay," she said. They sat there together on the edge of the bed in the morning light and didn't say anything else, and the silence was not comfortable and not hostile, and not the silence of two people performing closeness they didn't feel. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at something real and were letting it exist without trying to shape it into something more manageable. After a while, Raina stood up. "I'm going back to the city today. 3 days. I'll be gone before you get back." "I know." She looked at her sister one more time. Tessa looked back. All of it was still there between them, and some of it was not going to heal, and some of it, in time, might, and neither of them knew which parts were which yet, and that was the truth of it, and they were both old enough to let it be true. Raina left the room. She packed her bag properly this time, all of it, everything she'd brought, and a few things she'd accumulated in 6 weeks that were hers now by the simple logic of use and time. She did it methodically and without rush. When she was done, she carried it downstairs and set it near the front entrance and went to find Lucien. He was in the library, not working, standing at the window with his coffee, looking out at the grounds the way she'd seen him stand at windows before. The specific quality of stillness that wasn't emptiness, but was the surface of something very active underneath. He heard her come in and didn't turn immediately, which meant he was finishing a thought. She waited. He turned. She looked at him in the library light, the pale eyes, the sharp face, the careful stillness, the man who had walked into her apartment 6 weeks ago and rearranged the physics of her life, and who she had spent 6 weeks mapping and had ended up inside. The wound was managed, and he was standing straight, and there were shadows under his eyes from the night, and he looked more real than she had ever seen him, less constructed, just the actual thing. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She picked up her bag. She walked to the front entrance and out into the cold winter morning and got into the car, and the door closed and the engine started and the estate moved past the windows. She didn't look back. Not because it was a gesture of moving on, not for drama, not to prove something to herself. She didn't look back because looking back wasn't what the moment required. The moment required looking forward, at the road, at the pale winter light coming through the windshield, at the life that was neither the one she'd left nor the one she'd been handed, but was becoming slowly and at real cost, the one she was choosing. The city arrived an hour later. Her building, the 4th-floor hallway that smelled like old cooking. Her apartment, cool and still and smaller than she remembered. The single armchair near the bookshelf with the worn edge where a dangerous man had sat with a folder on his knee and changed the direction of everything. She set her bag down inside the door. She stood in the middle of her apartment and looked at it. The books, the desk, the window where the rain had been coming down on the night the door was unlocked. The life she'd assembled from what was available. The worn groove sentences she'd told herself until she'd stopped believing them and started just saying them. She looked at it all for a long time. Then she started packing for real. Not the emergency suitcase of someone with 72 hours and no options. The deliberate, considered packing of someone who knows where she's going and is taking what she actually needs. She went through the apartment room by room with the same methodical precision she brought to network architecture, assessing, categorizing, deciding what was load-bearing and what was just accumulated weight she'd been carrying out of inertia. She donated 2 bags of clothing. She boxed her books and arranged for storage. She called her thesis advisor and had a real conversation. 40 minutes, honest, the situation explained in terms that were true without being specific. And at the end of it, she had a revised timeline and a remote arrangement, and the understanding that her advisor was a practical woman who cared about the work and not about the circumstances in which it was completed. She called 2 of her freelance clients and referred them to colleagues she trusted. She sat at her kitchen table on the second evening and ate a real meal she'd cooked herself and drank a glass of wine and sat in the quiet. Her phone was on the table. It buzzed once. A text from a number she recognized as new. 8 words. Somewhere warm, actual number. I'll call Thursday. No name. She looked at it for a moment. She typed back, okay. On the 3rd day, she stood on the small balcony off her kitchen in the early morning cold and looked at the city. The specific density of it, the sound it made, the life it contained in its indifferent millions. She thought about the person she'd been when she'd climbed these stairs 6 weeks ago with a wet jacket and a granola bar for dinner and the perpetual stone of anxiety in her chest. Young in the way you're young when you've been responsible so long you've forgotten to be anything else. Tired in the way you're tired when you're doing everything and none of it is yours. She thought about what it had cost. All of it. The contract, the choice, the night in the safe room. Tessa. The trust she'd given and the trust she'd broken, and the specific hard arithmetic of a relationship that would take years to renegotiate into something that could hold weight. It had cost a great deal. She was not sorry. The car came at 9. She carried her bags down the 4 flights for the last time and put them in the trunk and got in the back seat, and the city moved past the windows one more time, its noise and density and indifferent life, and then the highway, and then the tree line, and then the gates. They opened as the car approached. The estate rose through the bare winter trees, stone and iron and glass, sprawling and deliberate and very, very quiet. She looked at it through the windshield and felt none of the things she'd felt the first time. Not the controlled fear, not the managed assessment of a person taking the measure of a trap. She felt the specific feeling of arriving somewhere. Lucien was at the front entrance when the car stopped. Standing with his hands in his pockets, no jacket in the cold, the look of a man who had come outside to meet someone and wasn't performing anything about it. He watched the car door open. He watched her get out. She looked at him. He looked at her. The grounds were frost white and still, and the winter light was thin and pale and honest, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment didn't need filling. 3 days, she said. I counted, he said. She picked up her bag and walked past him through the entrance and into the warmth of the building, and he turned and followed, and the door closed behind them both, and the estate was quiet in the morning light, and the gate settled back into place. And somewhere in the distance a bird moved through the bare trees, and the frost held the world still and cold and clear. The woman who had carried her sister's wreckage for 7 years was gone. In her place was someone who had walked through fire of her own choosing and come out the other side knowing exactly what she was made of. Not harder, not colder, just finally, completely, her own.